I'm seeing red. Welcome to Ladies Fright. I'm your host, Joan. This year, America celebrated 250 years as an independent country. Here, we celebrate Independence Day on July 4th, when the Declaration of Independence was ratified. I know I'm a bit late, but I thought to honor this occasion, I could talk about a haunting which takes place on one of the biggest moments during the American Revolutionary War. In March of 1776, Mary Burton, along with her new husband, William Burton, were about to set sail with 119 other ships, all in order to escape Boston. Why would they and so many others be looking to do that? Well, you see, Mary and William were loyalists, or colonists who remained loyal to the British Crown during the Revolution. And Boston has been under siege by the Continental Army for 11 months, trying to get the British troops stationed there to leave. Some loyalists decided it was not safe to stay in a city ruled by revolutionaries and began to evacuate through the Boston harbor by ship, the only opening for escape they had. The winds were finally in their favor, and they were able to get out of Boston's inner harbor and out into the outer harbor. In order to capture some of the fleeing British naval ships, the Continental Army bombarded the fleet with cannon fire. During the barrage, Mary was struck with a cannonball to the back of the head. And I truly mean miraculously, she survives. For several days following, Mary suffers with literally splitting headaches and just knew she was not going to be able to leave Boston Harbor alive. Typically, someone who passed away on the ship would have a burial at sea, where their remains would be deposited into the ocean. The thing was, Mary was terrified of the ocean, and the idea of it being her final resting place tortured her. She begged her husband to please bury her in the earth. A few days later, while the ships are still in the harbor, Mary succumbs to her injuries and passes away. Without proper burial clothes, William chose to wrap his wife in a red quilt and sewed her inside. Determined to fulfill her dying wish, William got permission to leave the ship with her remains, but since the fleet could leave at any minute, he was not able to venture far from the shore. Well, technically the shore is land. William thought this would be good enough for now and buried his wife just barely, not in the ocean, on the beach of Long Island. Long Island is a small island that is 1.75 miles long and covers just 225 acres within Boston Harbor. He did, however, vow to return and give her a proper headstone, since all he had in the moment was a piece of driftwood to mark her final resting place on the east end of the island. As you may imagine, the driftwood grave marker did not last, which, even if it did say, it wouldn't have mattered since William never returned to Boston. Though, this is not the last time Boston would see Mary Burton. Mary is said to appear to those on Long Island, searching for her husband to come back and fulfill his promise. She is known as Boston Harbor's Lady in Red. As you could probably tell already, this is going to be a very history-heavy episode. But honestly, very few of my episodes are not. The tension that eventually led to the American Revolutionary War began with, not surprisingly if you study history, a different war. Between 1754 and 1763, the French Indian War required British troops to be deployed to the US colonies. At the time, England was engaged in many a skirmish. We're talking about 25 to 30 major battles between 1600 to 1700 AD. War is not inexpensive, and since England did us that huge favor of defending us from the French, they were just going to let us pay them back through taxes. The major ones being the Stamp Act of 1765, which put a tax on all paper goods, government documents, and even playing cards. And the Townshend Acts of 1767, which put taxes on British imports to the colonies, like glass, paint, paper, and tea. The Townshend Acts were particularly unpopular and were repealed in 1770, except they kept the tax on tea. The British Parliament believed it was their right to raise revenue from the colonies whether they approved of it or not. Feeling it was unfair that these taxes were put on them without even asking, left some colonists questioning if a government across the ocean could have their best interest in mind. This began the rally cry of no taxation without representation, demanding having an advocate in Parliament for the American colonies. The taxation on tea felt particularly unfair due to the lack of diversity in the tea market. During the Townshend Act, some Boston merchants were able to avoid the tax by getting smuggled Dutch tea. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, in 1773, Parliament passed a Tea Act designed to aid the financially troubled East India Company by granting it 1. A monopoly on all tea exported to the colonies, 2. An exemption on the export tax, and 3. A quote-unquote drawback or refund on duties owed on certain surplus quantities of tea in its possession. The tea sent to the colonies was to be carried only in East India Company ships and sold only through its own agents, bypassing the independent colonial shippers and merchants. The company could sell the tea at a less than usual price in either America or Britain. It could undersell anyone else. The perception of monopoly drove the normally conservative colonial merchants into an alliance with radicals led by Samuel Adams and his Sons of Liberty, unquote. This left some Bostonians ready to spill the tea. Literally. Wow. If y'all didn't know I was a teacher before, that line sure gave it away. On December 16th, 1773, colonists snuck onto the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver ships, all docked in Boston Harbor, and threw 342 chests of tea overboard. Historians have confirmed 116 men who took part. However, it is believed possibly 150 men participated. They hid their identities by dressing up as Mohawk Native Americans, which is a whole other rabbit hole that I don't have time to get into today, but I do suggest reading the Colonial Williamsburg article, Why Colonists Dressed as Mohawks at the Boston Tea Party, to learn more. You can find the link to it in my reference document, linked in the description. Even before this significant show of rebellion, Bostonians had already been on notice with the English government. In October of 1768, British troops had made landfall in Boston and began an occupation of the city and surrounding areas. At one point, 1/3 of the people living in the greater Boston area were British soldiers. The Boston Tea Party only upset the British more, and General Thomas Gage was sent with an additional 4,000 troops to disband the government of Massachusetts Bay, which was led by Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Not one to accept defeat, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress not only continued to meet, but also started to form local militias. Gage enforced the British Parliament's Boston Port Act of 1774. This closed Boston Port and led to thousands of people losing their jobs. 8 years into British occupation and 2 years after the Boston Tea Party, on April 19th, what would come to be known as the shot heard round the world took place at the battles of Lexington and Concord. British troops were going to Concord to seize military supplies, only to find themselves face to face with several surrounding local militias. The British forces suffered mass casualties on their retreat back to Boston. After hearing the call from Minutemen, such as Paul Revere, the night before on April 18th, all the New England colonies sent their militias to Boston to form a line from Chelsea to Roxbury, blocking all land escapes for the British. This began the Siege of Boston. The siege was to prevent the British troops from moving by land. The siege lasted for 11 months, with many loyalists who lived outside the city fleeing into British-held territory, fearing it was not safe in the countryside. Without going into all the military moves and battles of that 11 months, I will mention the one which led to Mary's fate. Revolutionary Colonel Henry Knox and a team of engineers went to Fort Ticonderoga in New York and moved 59 cannons, weighing about 60 tons, across the Hudson and Connecticut River to Dorchester Heights in Massachusetts. For the last 300 miles the cannons needed to travel, in order to keep the wagons quiet and less easy to detect, straw was wrapped around the wagon's wheels. Some of the cannons captured provided a size and range much larger than any firepower the revolutionaries had possessed previously. On March 2nd, 1776, the Americans began to bomb Boston with cannon fire. A little over a week later, the British fleet sat in the harbor ready to evacuate. They just had to wait until the winds were favorable. Finally, On the 17th, the winds became favorable, allowing them to leave the harbor. While marching to the ships, the British troops were told they could burn the town if they were met with any obstructions. Abigail Adams was able to see the harbor and described the view of the ship's mast as a forest. 120 ships were underway by 9 a.m. The fleet carried 9,906 British troops, 667 women, and 553 children, making a total of 11,000 people in the evacuation. This left Boston to the Continental Army and was the first major victory in America's war for independence. Such an event is important, and the city of Boston recognizes March 17th as Evacuation Day. It became a legal holiday in 1901 upon the proclamation of Mayor Thomas N. Hart, which I found interesting because March 17th is St. Patrick's Day in the United States, and Boston has a lot of pride for their Irish heritage. Though a celebration of the British fleeing feels very Irish. In 1938, when it was officially signed into law as a holiday in Suffolk County, the law was signed with both black and green ink. The green ink was suggested to Governor Livry Salsonsol by Senator Joseph L. Murphy, with a note that said, quote, "I believe it is appropriate to use the favorite color of our mutual ancestry," unquote. On Evacuation Day, schools and government offices in Suffolk County were closed, though it seems the fun couldn't have lasted forever, and in 2010, the state legislature debated eliminating it as an official holiday on the grounds that it was not in the budget to give state workers so many paid days off. So, in 2011, the budget required all municipal offices to be opened. Focusing back now on Mary Burton, as I had said, Mary's spirit is said to be seen well after Evacuation Day. In 1804, fishermen found themselves shipwrecked on Long Island. They heard the sound of mournful sighs. When they found where the sound was coming from, they were horrified to see a woman. Okay. Not her being a woman was horrifying. It was more that she was bleeding from a wound in the back of her head and floating over the hills. The ghostly figure stood out from the rest of her surroundings due to her being covered in a bright red fabric. Years later, in 1891, soldiers stationed in Fort Strong found on Long Island reported seeing a figure of a woman in red. Needing to give her more of a hardcore name, the military men called her the Woman in Scarlet. From what I gathered, both these tales come from Edward Rowe Snow's 1935 book. Snow was an American writer and historian with a special interest in New England. Outside of those popular tales, I found another which said she roams the island every night looking for someone to give her a proper burial. One video says she has also been known to drag strangers into the tide and force their heads into the shallow waters until they choke, which feels very campfire tale to me. I only heard this in one place, and I feel like a violent detail like this would be more popular in recounts of the story, so I don't really buy it. Clearly, something very important to the story is the red fabric, which distinguishes the ghost from all the other mournful women hanging around the harbor, which there are more. There's a woman in white and the woman in black, but they are tales I'll save for another day. I thought maybe I should look into the fashion of the time of the sightings, seeing if maybe they would give us a clue to the story behind the woman in red, with the first item to address being the famous color. I had wondered how common red was as a color for clothes and other fabrics. Turns out, very common, even centuries ago. The earliest found example of red dyed fabric dates back to the 6th millennium BC in Turkey. Turns out a lot of major historical cultures had red fabric. The Egyptians, Spartans, Persians, Romans, and many more throughout Europe. Though common throughout history, the color was not common for the everyday person. Good red dye was hard to come by. Often, the color would come out after the fabric had been washed. Finding a dye that would keep the fabric red made any thread stained with the color highly valuable. That was until the Europeans were introduced to cochineal from Mexico in the 16th century. Spanish conquistadors were amazed by the brilliant red dye stuff natives were selling. This was called grana cochineal, or cochineal. So what is cochineal? Well, brace yourselves, cause I know some of you are not gonna like this answer. It is a bug. Yeah, A cochineal is an insect known to become an infestation on prickly pears. As a defense mechanism, the cochineal produces a carbonic acid. This acid is what is used as the red dye color. It took 70,000 cochineal to make 1 pound of the dye. When dried, it proved easy to transport. So, transport them they did to Europe. Cochineal became so profitable, it was one of the pillars supporting Spain's economy for centuries. This dye was so sought after that in 1585, a cochineal cartel was formed. By 1625, the Dutch also had a production of cochineal dyes and would take on commissions for other European countries. One of the most notable commissions, and important to today's topic, Oliver Cromwell's redesign of the British Army's infantry coats. Prior to this, thick leather and suits of armor were the standard wear for battle, with long colored sashes being utilized to show whose army you were fighting for. Cromwell's design included the bright red coats the British Army was known for up until the 1800s.
I've got out a selection of uniforms to kind of look at the development and how they change over time, starting with one of the earliest things we have, 1640s. Leather jerkin worn by a light cavalryman or harquebusier. Really amazing thick leather, would have been really good at stopping sword cuts, much lighter than armour, but you could wear a back and breastplate with it. One of the things that came in the Civil War was scarves or sashes, because some could actually be up to 9 foot long, and that was to try and really help you work out who was on your side and who wasn't. Because obviously on a really busy battlefield you need some kind of idea of who is who and who you're supposed to be fighting.
And so why are we starting at the Civil War? Were people not wearing uniforms before then? Or?
No, so you don't really have uniform before then. You do have liveries, people wearing clothes to denote what household they are fighting alongside or with. You also find people putting leaves and things onto their hats and jackets to denote kind of who they are, but obviously not very good, which is why scarves are really important, and that is really the beginning of kind of uniform coming in or having some kind of recognition.
So what's it made of exactly?
So it's made of leather.
Okay.
It would originally have had leather sleeves, but a much more softer, pliable leather, and you can see some of the stitch holes from where they would have been in place.
Okay.
And the other thing that kind of gives us an idea of how expensive and well made it is it's kind of got remnants of metallic thread. You could wear it underneath armour, you could wear it with a back and breastplate, but it could be worn on its own. Obviously armour is much better at stopping sword slashes and people trying to get at you with their pike, but this would also do a good job. And also, because as a light cavalryman, he would have been on a horse as well, so he's higher up and off the ground.
Okay, great. Well, that's a good start. Now we're moving on here. We're jumping a bit in time to this one.
Yes, it's a bit of a jump. This one dates to 1773. Okay. But just to give you a little fill-in for the gaps that we have, when it's the Restoration in 1660, the Standing Army is created and a lot of regiments are disbanded and some are kept, but it's only the horse and foot guards. So this is an example of the first regiment of foot guards. It's an other ranks coat, so it would be a lot less flashy than the officers. Lace is a really big feature of clothing kind of around this time. You see it's got a longer, wider skirt on the coat. I kind of think it probably wasn't the most helpful for marching in. It could kind of get in the way of fighting.
Do we have any reports of what people thought about wearing this kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's jumping forward ever so slightly, but there's a brilliant open letter to an editor of the Time Mercury in 1806 of a guy who writes in complaining about how extravagant uniforms are and how difficult certain aspects of them are. And my favourite part of it, he says, "Can we not fight without dying in tinsel because of all of these extra pieces?"
Which did make me wonder if the reason a red quilt was mentioned in the story was to be a symbolic nod to the British Army, which were known as the quote-unquote redcoats. I wondered if this ghost story was just a metaphor for the violence British occupation caused Boston and how the impression would never truly leave. Haunting of the harbor was less paranormal and more a reminder. Due to the sightings being in the 19th century, I should mention how red fabric was viewed then. At the start of the 19th century, when the first Mary Burton sighting was said to have happened, red was still seen as a color representing power. However, by the end of the century, when the next sighting was said to have happened, the color became very scarce. The color fell out of popularity based on its association with promiscuity, which brings me to my next point of observing the story through tropes. One of the most common types of ghost story is the woman in white. These stories typically have shared details. A young woman who died suddenly usually has some kind of romantic element involved, like she was on the way to a dance or to meet her love, and her spirit appears in a white outfit, which is often to reflect the spirit's innocent nature. And when I say innocent, I mean virginal. Repeated details through many stories, which let the audience know what the story is going to be about, is known as a trope. The Red Lady, or the Lady in Red, is also a trope found in the paranormal, defined by the traits of a female spirit who was vain, or was a jilted lover, killed in a violent way, like a fit of passion, and adorned by a scarlet garment, typically a dress. This trope is also found outside the paranormal in media as well. The Lady in Red has also been known as the vamp, or the femme fatale, often depicted as a sex worker and work associated with loose morals, like dancers, actors, and chorus girls. The Lady in Red is defined by her sexual prowess and her dominant, loud personality. I should mention, this more applies to European and Western ideas than Eastern. In some Asian cultures like China and Malaysia, Lady in Red spirits are vengeful and come back to haunt those who have wronged them. This archetype became really popular in Victorian-era Europe, which had a fascination with the supernatural. A story which became super popular during this time was that of the Red Lady of Leap Castle in Ireland, who I will, of course, have to cover at a later time. These European tales carried over to the New World, and the America's Lady in Red has very similar story beats. A woman who is wearing red, or she is covered in blood and her garments now look red, meets a violent end and returns to show the feelings of betrayal still lingering even after death. The stories of a Red Lady are often tales of unresolved physical trauma. So, does Mary Burton's ghost story fit into this trope? Well, she is famous for wearing red, so that is a major qualifier out of the way. Next, a violent death. Blunt force trauma to the back of the head via cannonball is no doubt a violent death. Now this leaves the final major qualifier of the Lady in Red trope: betrayal. Mary's life didn't end based on her lover's actions. Often stories of jilted lovers will be the man abandoning the woman and her ending her own life out of despair, or the man ending her himself. Either the abandonment or the harm is where the betrayal stems from. Mary was not harmed by her husband. If anything, the story strives to portray him as dedicated to her and how he works to get her buried on land instead of the more convenient burial at sea. Where the betrayal comes in is the unfulfilled promise to return and mark her final resting place. Now, is that the greatest betrayal? I would say it's not when you consider other ghost stories of women being abandoned or even killed by their lovers for being pregnant and risking his reputation in some way. However, betrayal can be a very personal feeling. I feel betrayed if a friend watches the next episode of a series we are watching together, or when my husband walks too far ahead of me at the airport. Would I come back and haunt them for these slights? I mean, maybe. Depends on how petty I feel at the time of death. My point being, betrayal can be subjective, and a broken promise is not an outlandish reason. The Red Lady of Boston Harbor serves as a reminder of the broken promises and violence it took for the United States to reach independence. Her red color may represent the British military that was the occupying enemy, or the bloodshed to gain freedom from an oppressive rule. Her mournful cries not allowing her to be forgotten. Proper grave marker be damned. But what do I know? I'm just some lady talking about some frights. Okay. Thank you for listening. It is actually July 3rd when I'm filming this. Gotta do a quick turnaround on this one, let me tell you. But yeah, writing this was so interesting. I remember American history and I remember specific things, but like, you don't always like remember the details or like the sequence of events. So it was really interesting to go back into that. Have I been listening? Keep it like this. Sorry. Have I been listening to the Hamilton soundtrack on repeat? Of course, it's the 250th anniversary of independence. And, you know, I gotta sing about Alexander Hamilton. I think that's the rules, honestly. At least in this house it is. But yeah, I actually gotta go. We're going to see a fireworks show. I know it's still, you can clearly see it's still light outside, but I gotta get everything ready. We're gonna go see a fireworks show. That's pretty exciting. So yeah, here at Ladies Fright, I like to offer you 10%. 10% of what, I hear you asking? Great question. I'd love to answer it. You could get 10% more freedom, or you could get 10% less likely to have a finger blown off by a firework. Or you could get 10% more indigestion from eating too many hot dogs. But you won't know until you like, comment, subscribe, or share. And then you can get up to 30% because it builds on itself. And this time only because it's America's birthday and we're celebrating independence. I will let you have up to 40%. You hear me, 40% if you share. So that being said, for those of you who celebrate, have a happy Independence Day. For those who don't, I hope you have a great regular rest of your day. And yeah, be responsible. Bye.